I'm Dr. Mark Catala, and I want to welcome you to the 7th chapter of Schultz and Schultz's History of Modern Psychology. Today we'll be talking about the development and founding of functionalism, which is mostly about William James and G. Stanley Hall. But let's get started with Herbert Spencer. Now, when he arrived in the United States in 1882, he was a celebrity because interest in evolution was strong in the United States at the time, actually higher than it is today. Spencer argued that all aspects of the universe were evolutionary, including human character and social institutions. He coins the phrase survival of the fittest, and he believed that human perfection was inevitable as long as no action was taken to interfere with the natural order of things. So no regulation of business and industry, and no educational, housing, or food assistance for the poor. This message was consistent at the time with America's individualistic spirit and free enterprise system. He calls his philosophy synthetic philosophy, but it's also been called social Darwinism. And this is the application of evolutionary theory to human knowledge and experience. He published his 10 books between 1860 and 1897 and was hailed as a genius. Alfred Russel Wallace named his son Spencer, and Darwin said that Spencer was a dozen times my superior, although he did not like Spencer personally. What about the evolution of machines? Well, Samuel Butler writes Darwin Among the Machines, and he proposed that mechanical evolution was occurring through the same processes that guided human evolution. New machines eliminate or render extinct older, inferior machines that can no longer adapt or compete in the marketplace. In other words, nobody today is still driving a Model T Ford. Now, the examples that Butler uses are how primitive devices such as levers, wedges, and pulleys have been replaced by steam-driven locomotives and ocean liners. But I think you can see how advancements in technology continue to prove Butler's point. Let's talk about the importance of the 1890 census, which is that it couldn't be completed. Now, it took 7 years to complete the information from the 1880 census, and the 1890 census was going to have even more information that they were collecting. And so it wasn't going to be finished before the 1900 census was going to begin, so something needed to be done. Enter Herman Hollerith. His idea was to use punch cards to record census information, and he used 56 million cards to record the results from 62 million people, and he finished the 1890 census by 1892. He eventually started his own business, which he called the Tabulating Machine Company, and it became IBM, which is International Business Machines. Well, William James is really important in psychology. Historians have ranked him behind Wundt, only behind Wundt in his importance, but many colleagues viewed him as a negative force in psychology. This was because he maintained a widely publicized interest in mental telepathy, clairvoyance, spiritualism, communication with the dead at seances, and other mystical things like that. Later in life, he didn't even want to be known as a psychologist. He even stated that psychology was merely, quote, an elaboration of the obvious. So you may ask yourself, who was this guy? He was born in 1842 to a very, very wealthy New York family. They were the second richest family in America, and his mother only paid attention to him when he was sick. So he was sick quite a bit. He considered becoming an artist, a doctor, and a biologist. He didn't become an artist because he didn't think he had enough talent, and he thought that doctors didn't do much more than extract money from their patients, so he didn't want to be a doctor either. He considered becoming a biologist, and he went on an 1865 biological expedition to Brazil, which is where the picture is from, but he couldn't tolerate the precise collecting or the physical demands of field work. He was frequently ill, suffering from depression, digestive disorders, insomnia, etc. And one of his biographers noted that James was an accomplished complainer about his eyes, his back, his low spirits, his aimless existence, etc. But he was able to earn his medical degree from Harvard in 1869. James apparently suffered from neurasthenia, which was a particularly American type of nervousness. The symptoms included depression, anxiety, insomnia, hypochondria, headache, skin rash, nervous exhaustion, and brain collapse. James accepted a teaching position at Harvard in physiology in 1872 and became interested in the effects of mind-altering drugs and tried nitrous oxide, which is commonly called laughing gas, and amyl nitrate, which is poppers. And he was interested in the altered states of consciousness that those drugs created. In 1875, he teaches the relations between physiology and psychology. So Harvard becomes the first school in the United States to offer a psychology course. Now, James had never taken a psychology course, and the first lecture he attended was his own. In 1878, he gets married and signs a publishing contract. Those two events are linked because although it took him 12 years to finish the book, he started it on his honeymoon. Now, I should also mention that James's marriage wasn't the happiest one for his wife. He would travel whenever a child of his was born, and after the birth of his second child, he went to Italy for a year and wrote his wife that he had fallen in love with an Italian woman. James felt that his affectionate nature would please his wife, and he also flirted with the family servants. In 1889, he was named professor of psychology at Harvard, and by that time, James had met a number of European psychologists, including Wundt. He said that Wundt isn't a genius, he's a professor. He publishes The Principles of Psychology in 1890, and it was a tremendous success as a textbook. Wundt, Titchener, and even James himself didn't like it, though. Wundt wrote, "It's literature. It is literature. It is beautiful, but it is not psychology." And James said that the book proved that there was no such thing as a science of psychology. And after its publication, James wanted nothing more to do with psychology. He arranged for Hugo Munsterberg to come over from Germany to run Harvard's psychology lab, and from then on, he turned to philosophy. But you might ask, why was the book such a success? Really, three reasons. The first is that James writes with a clarity that's rare in science. He also opposed Wundt's view of psychology, which was quite popular at the time, and James offered an alternative way of looking at the mind, and that view was congruent with the functional approach to psychology, to study living people as they adapt to their environment. Well, what was his approach? Well, James disagrees with Wundt's approach to consciousness, as I said, and sees it as artificial and narrow. He says we can think about a stimulus on more than one occasion, but our thoughts each time will not be identical. So James sees consciousness as a continuous flow, and any attempt to divide it can only distort it. So he coins the term stream of consciousness. Also, to supplement introspection and experimentation, James recommended the comparative method. And by this he means that studying the psychological functioning of different populations, such as animals, infants, and emotionally disturbed people, psychology could uncover meaningful variations in mental life. He also develops the James Lange theory of emotion. Now, traditionally, people would say, I see a bear, I get scared, and I run away. James reverses the order to, I see a bear, I run, therefore I'm scared, so that the emotion comes after the bodily reaction. And he thought this was especially true for what he labels the coarser emotions of fear, rage, grief, and love. He also suggests that a person's sense of self is made up of three components: the material, social, and spiritual self. So your material self is what we would call our own, our body, our home, our style of dress. The social self is how we present different sides of ourselves to different people, and the spiritual self refers to our inner or subjective being. Well, let's discuss functional inequality, basically how women were held back in psychology during this era. And let's start with Mary Whiton Calkins. Now, she was the first woman to be president of the APA in 1905, and she was actually also the president of the American Philosophical Association in 1918. Oh, the APA again being the American Psychological Association. Now, she studied with James at Harvard, but was denied her PhD. Now, she'd earned her PhD, but was denied it because she was a woman. Harvard did not award doctoral degrees to women until 1963. Later, Harvard offered her a degree from Radcliffe, but Calkins turned it down because she'd earned her degree from Harvard, not from Radcliffe. She had developed a paired associate task for memory, and that was what her dissertation was about, and it was published in 1896, and she was eventually offered an honorary degree from Columbia. She was also the first woman to establish a psychology laboratory in 1891, and she did it with $200. Let's discuss the variability hypothesis. Darwin wrote that in many species, males showed a wider range of physical characteristics and abilities than females. The characteristics and abilities of females were found to be clustered around the mean, and so this was extrapolated to the belief that women would be less likely to achieve in intellectual or scholarly work. Support for this incorrect hypothesis also came from phrenology, which said that women had smaller brains than men. Helen Bradford Thompson Wholey, and that's her picture off to the right when she's younger. She got a PhD from the University of Chicago in 1900, and she tests the variability hypothesis. She administers tests to men and women, and the tests measured motor abilities, sensory thresholds, intellectual abilities, and personality traits. And she found no differences. That there were no differences in emotional functioning and insignificant differences elsewhere. Women were slightly superior to men in memory and sensory perception, and she attributed any differences to differences in the ways that boys and girls were raised. Letta Stetter Hollingworth grew up in a sod hut in Nebraska and graduated from college there in 1906. Then she got her PhD from Columbia University in 1916. She worked with Thorndike at Columbia. And she also did research which refuted the variability hypothesis and notions of female inferiority. For example, she found that the menstrual cycle was not related to performance on perceptual and motor tasks or intellectual ability. And those were common beliefs at the time. She also coined the term gifted children and was active in the movement to get women the right to vote. Well, let's turn to G. Stanley Hall. And Hall achieves a number of firsts in psychology. Now, he graduated from Williams College and was voted the smartest person in his class. He studied theology in Germany before returning to the United States to teach various classes at Antioch College. He became interested in psychology and started working with William James, earning the first American doctoral degrees in psychology in 1878. Then he went to Leipzig to study with Wundt in 1879. So he was literally the first American student in the first year of the first psychology laboratory in 1879. Now, he comes back from Germany and was offered a professorship at Johns Hopkins, and in 1883 set up the first American psychology laboratory. He also started the first American psychology journal, aptly called the American Journal of Psychology, in 1887, and it's still in existence today. He's also the first president of Clark University, and you can see their seal there off to the right, Fiat Lux, which means let there be light. Now, Hall wanted Clark to be a research university, and in 1909, he brought both Freud and Jung there for an international conference, and it was Freud's only trip to the United States. Hall is also the first president of the American Psychological Association in 1892. And by 1900, it had 127 members. I guess I should mention he was also president a second time in 1924. In his 36 years at Clark, 81 doctorates in psychology were awarded, including the first to an African American, Francis Cecil Sumner, who studied with Hall. With all of that said, many people who knew Hall didn't like him. He was described as difficult, untrustworthy, unscrupulous, devious, and aggressively self-promoting. So in other words, he was a typical administrator working in higher education. He publishes his book Adolescence in 1904. The full title was actually Adolescence, Its Psychology, and its relations to physiology, anthropology, sociology, sex, crime, religion, and education. It was 1,300 pages long, which is mostly the title, I think, and it contained Hall's recapitulation theory of human development, which was the idea that the psychological development of children repeats the history of the human race. Many people were critical of this book. Thorndike said that, or wrote about it, he said it was chock full of errors, masturbation, and Jesus. He is a madman, referring to Hall. At age 78, Hall also wrote a book called Senescence, which is about the psychological issues of aging. And so he's also considered one of the founders of gerontology. Well, functionalism wasn't founded as a school of thought, and it was really Titchener who created this whole structural versus functional split in psychology. But the University of Chicago and Columbia University became closely associated with functionalism. So let's start by talking about the University of Chicago, John Dewey and James Roland Angell. Now, John Dewey gets his PhD from Johns Hopkins in 1884, and he wrote the first American textbook in psychology in 1886. It was called Psychology, which is not very creative, and it's ironic because Dewey was absolutely a horrible teacher. He would come into class in a green cap, put the green cap on the table, and then sit and lecture to the green cap in a monotone. It's also interesting because he was considered an educational reformer and was apparently a horrible professor. He writes a very famous article called The Reflex Arc Concept in Psychology. And the reason he wrote this article, or one of the points he makes in it, I guess I should say, is that neither behavior nor consciousness could be reduced to elements, as Wundt and Titchener were proposing. And Dewey says a reflex forms more of a circle than an arc because the stimulus and response must be considered as a unit and not individually. But that's considered a very famous article in functional psychology. James Roland Angell gets his master's from Harvard in 1892. He went to Germany for his PhD, but his German wasn't very good, so he never finished his PhD. However, he did eventually earn 23 honorary degrees and became president of Yale and also president of the APA in 1906. He used his APA presidential address to outline what functional psychology was all about. So he said the task of functionalism is to discover how a mental process operates, what it accomplishes, and under what conditions it occurs. He also said that functional psychology was concerned with the total relationship of the organism to its environment, and that if consciousness has survived, it must have a purpose. And so the job of psychology was to find out what that purpose was. How about functionalism at Columbia? Yes, Columbia University, whose motto is, "In your light, we see the light." Again, with the light. Robert Sessions Woodworth was active in psychology for 60 years, although he did not consider himself to be a functionalist. He said that he would never take marching orders from any school. Now, two experiences changed his life. He heard a G. Stanley Hall lecture, and he read William James's Principles of Psychology and decided to quit his job as a high school math teacher and go into psychology. So he worked with Cattell on his PhD at Columbia and taught there from 1903 to 1945. But he was such a popular professor that he continued to lecture at Columbia until he was 89 years old. He also received the first gold medal award from the American Psychological Association in 1956 for his, quote, unequaled contributions to shaping the destiny of scientific psychology. So that's quite an honor. He was a very popular psychologist. Basically comes up with two ideas, SOR psychology and dynamic psychology. SOR is essentially stimulus, organism, and response. So you have to start with the stimulus and response because they're objective external events, but in attempting to explain behavior, the most important part of the study is the living organism itself. And the way to study what occurs inside the organism is through introspection. Dynamic psychology is a focus on motivation, or what he calls motivology. And the goal was to determine why people behave as they do. So let's finish with criticisms and contributions of functionalism. Now, Titchener argued that functionalism wasn't psychology at all. Why? Well, because it didn't adhere to structuralism's subject matter and methods. But that's what the functionalists were rebelling against anyway. Structuralists also objected to psychology going into applied work, and they felt that psychology should remain a pure science. But the functionalists argued that applied work could adhere to scientific procedures and valid research could be performed in factories and classrooms, not just laboratories. Now, on the positive side, functionalists, although I don't think the structuralists really have good criticisms, but the functionalists expanded the scope of psychology and they moved beyond introspection, gathering data with mental tests, questionnaires, and physiological research. So that's chapter 7, and thanks for listening.